Unmasking History, the Fabricated Legacy of White Supremacy. Hello, dear listeners. Today, we embark on a journey to examine the great mirror of history together. But this mirror is shattered. For thousands of years, someone has been deliberately creating fractures in it. Think back to the Western civilization history you learned in school. The brilliant Greek philosophy, the mighty Roman Empire, and modern Western civilization claiming to be their descendants. Doesn't it sound like a magnificent epic? But this epic contains fatal errors. Today, we will dig deep into the core of those errors. Specifically, the question: why do white people claim to be descendants of ancient Greeks and Romans? This question contains depths that go beyond simple historical curiosity. It encompasses struggles over the legitimacy of power, ownership of civilization, and truth itself. The phenomenon of people we now call white, particularly Northern European peoples, claiming to be inheritors of ancient civilizations, is not merely a matter of pride. This is a systematically constructed ideology, the result of centuries of historical distortion. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, just as modern people beautify their past on social media, Western civilization as a whole has been packaging its history with an Instagram filter for centuries. The only difference is that the scale is not individual, but continental. Through this audiobook, we will carefully examine everything from the story that began in the Caucasus Mountains, to the reality of ancient civilizations, to the mechanisms of historical distortion that continue to this day. Truth can sometimes be uncomfortable, but that discomfort is precisely what drives our growth. Chapter 1. The Secret of Caucasian. People who descended from the Caucasus Mountains. When you hear the word Caucasian, what comes to mind? Most of you probably know it as meaning white person, but when you learn the true meaning and history of this word, you'll realize how arbitrary and political modern racial classification systems are. Caucasian literally means from the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus Mountains are a rugged mountain range located between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, including the regions of present-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. This area has been a cultural crossroads where various peoples have lived and intersected since ancient times. The term was coined by German anthropologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in the 18th century. He thought that a skull found in the Georgian region was the most beautiful, and he classified races based on this standard. Here we can already see that subjective aesthetic criteria, rather than scientific objectivity, were involved. But when we examine actual history, the people of the Caucasus region had quite different appearances from what we now call white Northern Europeans. They were closer to Mediterranean types, often having olive skin and dark hair. So how did the Germanic tribes of Northern Europe come to appropriate this Caucasian identity? This is the result of a complex historical process. From around the 8th century BCE, various tribes from the Caucasus region began migrating southward. This was due to climate change, pressure from nomads, and the search for better agricultural conditions. Some of these groups advanced into Europe via the Anatolian Peninsula, while others headed toward Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. Particularly noteworthy is that these Caucasian tribes created new cultural syntheses as they encountered existing civilizations during their migrations. This was a process of cultural exchange and fusion, not simple conquest. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, modern white supremacism is like luxury brands exaggerating their history. They create the illusion of pure bloodlines, while actually being a mixture of various cultures. These tribes from the Caucasus were by no means homogeneous. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and had different ways of life. But later, their descendants would bind themselves together as one race. This was due to political necessity rather than scientific fact. More interesting is that these Caucasian tribes underwent physical changes as they adapted to the environment while settling in Northern Europe. In the Northern European environment, with little sunlight, their skin gradually lightened for vitamin D synthesis, and their hair and eye colours also became lighter. This was the result of natural selection over thousands of years. But this biological adaptation process later became disguised as evidence of superiority. It's like interpreting a polar bear's white fur, which is the result of environmental adaptation, as a symbol of purity. Understanding this historical context reveals how artificial modern racial concepts are. The classification that began with the geographic name Caucasus came to define racial systems worldwide, reflecting the power relations of a particular era rather than scientific evidence. Chapter 2: The Real Faces of Greeks and Romans. Now let us journey to ancient Greece and Rome, called the roots of Western civilization. But there is a considerable gap between the glorious image of those civilizations we imagine and actual history. Let's first examine the actual appearance of ancient Greeks. Looking at surviving ancient Greek sculptures, most are made of white marble, but this creates a misleading impression. Originally, all these sculptures were painted. The colors faded over time. Combining archaeological evidence and literary sources, ancient Greeks mostly had Mediterranean-type appearances. Olive skin, dark brown hair, and brown eyes were typical. This resembles current Greeks, southern Italians, and people from western Turkey. In Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, we can confirm this from descriptions of characters' appearances. While Achilles is sometimes described as golden-haired, this is mentioned as an exceptional case, and most heroes are described as having black hair or dark hair. More importantly, ancient Greek society was much more diverse than we currently think. Greece was a confederation of city-states, polis, and each city had different tribal origins. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, etc. Each had different cultural backgrounds. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, when modern people speak of Greek civilization, they think of it like a unified brand, but it was actually a collection of competing companies that constantly waged war against each other. Rome's case is even more complex. Rome was a multi-ethnic empire from the beginning. The city of Rome itself began as an alliance of several tribes: Latin, Sabine, Etruscan, and others. As the empire expanded, people from various regions, Gaul, present-day France, Iberia, Spain, North Africa, Syria, Egypt, became Roman citizens. We can clearly see this from the origins of Roman emperors. Trajan was from Hispania, Spain, as was Hadrian. Septimius Severus was from North Africa, and Philip the Arab was from Syria. They were all legitimate Roman emperors. Roman law also confirms this diversity. The Antonine constitution issued by Emperor Caracalla in 212 CE granted Roman citizenship to all free people within the empire. This applied regardless of skin color or region of origin. So where does our current image of Romans come from? This is largely a product of imagination created by European artists after the Renaissance. Artists like Michelangelo and Raphael painted ancient Romans to look like themselves. We can also confirm this from ancient literature. The Roman historian Tacitus described the Germanic tribes, mentioning blonde hair and blue eyes as their characteristics. This means such appearances were foreign to Romans. If Romans themselves had blonde hair and blue eyes, there would have been no reason to mention this as a special characteristic. Romans also called the Germanic tribes barbarous, meaning barbarians. This shows that Romans perceived themselves and the Germanic tribes as fundamentally different beings, beyond mere cultural differences. Interestingly, the Germanic tribes, ancestors of present-day Northern European whites, were civilized by the Roman Empire. They gradually became civilized by learning Roman education, law, architecture, and agricultural techniques. This means that current Western civilization is actually the result of influence from Mediterranean civilization. Chapter 3: The Shadow of the Moorish Empire, the Hidden History of the Iberian Peninsula. Now we move to an important chapter that has been deliberately minimized or distorted in European history. This is the story of the Moorish Empire. This story raises fundamental questions about current white European identity. In 711 CE, Moors composed of Berber and Arab peoples conquered the Iberian Peninsula. They were not mere conquerors. What they brought was a highly developed civilization. They were far ahead of contemporary Europe in all fields: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, architecture, and agricultural technology. Cordoba became one of Europe's largest cities around the 10th century. With a population of 500,000, this was much larger than Paris or London at the same time. Cordoba had 70 libraries and 900 public baths. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe during the same period, bathing was considered pagan. The knowledge brought by the Moors became the foundation of current Western science. The word algebra itself comes from the Arabic al-jabr. Algorithm comes from the name of Persian mathematician al-Khwarizmi. The same applies to medicine. Andalusian physicians performed cataract surgery and kidney stone removal surgery. This was an unimaginable level for other parts of Europe. Cordoba's medical school was a center where students flocked from all over Europe. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, a considerable part of the scientific thinking and rationalism that current Western civilization boasts is actually borrowed from Islamic civilization. It's like a startup, copying existing companies' technology, and then claiming to have invented everything after succeeding. Under Moorish rule, the Iberian Peninsula became a model of religious tolerance. Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived together, freely practicing their respective religions. This was called convivencia, coexistence. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe during the same period, religious wars and persecution were constant. The Toledo School of Translators was a symbol of this cultural fusion. Scholars fluent in Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and Castilian worked together translating ancient Greek philosophical works and Islamic scientific texts. Many of Aristotle's works were reintroduced to Europe through Arabic translations into Latin. But in 1492, with the fall of Granada, Moorish rule of the Iberian Peninsula ended. What began afterward was systematic memory erasure work. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand needed to construct a new identity, not just reclaim territory. The Inquisition was established, and Muslims and Jews were forced to convert or face expulsion. Moriscos, forcibly converted Muslims, were monitored for decades and eventually completely expelled in the early 17th century. This was not mere religious persecution, but cultural memory annihilation. Buildings constructed by Moors were destroyed or converted to Christian styles. Cordoba's Great Mosque became a cathedral, and Seville's Alcazar became a Christian palace. But the basic structures and decorations of these buildings still retain Islamic styles. More important is the issue of bloodlines. During 800 years of Moorish rule, extensive intermarriage occurred on the Iberian Peninsula. Marriage between Moors, Berbers, Arabs, and existing Hispano-Romans and Visigoths was common. According to modern genetic research, a considerable portion of current Spanish and Portuguese populations carry genetic markers from North Africa and the Middle East. This proportion is especially high in the Andalusia region. But these historical facts conflicted with Europe's pure blood ideology after the 19th century. For Spain and Portugal to be recognized as part of Europe, they had to deny their African past. Chapter 4: The Germanic Migration and the Era of Roman Mercenaries. Now we examine one of the most dramatic turning points in European history, the Great Migration of Germanic tribes and their process of becoming Roman mercenaries. This period is crucial for understanding the origins of current white Europe. From around the 2nd century CE, Germanic tribes began moving south for various reasons: decreased agricultural productivity due to climate change, land shortages due to population growth, and pressure from the Huns pushing from the east. Initially, Romans regarded Germanic tribes as mere barbarians. The Germanic tribes described in Caesar's Gallic Wars were primitive tribes who had not received civilization's benefits. They relied on hunting and herding rather than settled agriculture and barely used writing. But the situation gradually changed. As the Roman Empire expanded, the military force needed for border defense increased, and Roman citizens increasingly avoided military service. At this time, Rome began using Germanic tribes as mercenaries. This process is called barbarization, but this was not a unidirectional process. While Germanic tribes became Romanized, the Roman Empire also became Germanized. This was a process of mutual cultural exchange. Germanic mercenaries didn't just provide military force. They learned Roman military technology, administrative systems, and legal institutions. At the same time, Romans adopted Germanic military tactics and social organizations. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, this is similar to modern global corporations seeking cheap labor in developing countries. Rome utilized Germanic cheap military force, but eventually handed over core technology and power to them. From the 4th to 5th centuries, this process accelerated. Various Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, settled within Roman territory. They initially served the Roman Empire with the status of foederati, federates. These Germanic leaders received Roman education and served in Roman offices. Stilicho was of Vandal origin, but became the de facto ruler of the Western Roman Empire. Arbogast was of Frankish origin and became a military commander of the Western Roman Empire. The most symbolic figure is Odoacer. He was of Germanic origin and deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. But he didn't call himself emperor. Instead, he called himself King of Italy. This shows he still respected Roman political traditions. The most important characteristic of this period is that Germanic tribes didn't destroy Roman civilization, but inherited it. They adopted Roman law, used Latin, and accepted Christianity. This is more accurately seen as transmission of civilization, rather than barbarian invasion. The case of the Franks clearly shows this. Clovis I was king of the Franks, but he considered receiving the position of Roman consul in honor. His successors also continued to maintain Roman political traditions, but this process of cultural fusion was later deliberately simplified. In the 19th century nationalist era, each European country sought its pure origins. France emphasized the Franks, Germany the Germanic tribes, and Britain the Anglo-Saxons. In this process, the complex interaction between Rome and Germanic tribes was reduced to a simple conquest narrative. Germanic tribes were reborn as ancestors of pure Europeans, and Rome as a symbol of classical European civilization. Chapter 5: Egyptian Wisdom and Masonic Secrets. Now we examine another important element hidden in the formation of Western civilization, the influence of Egyptian civilization and the process of knowledge transmission through Freemasonry. This story has been deliberately minimized or concealed in current white civilization narratives. Ancient Egypt was one of humanity's first advanced civilizations. Egyptian civilization began around 3100 BCE when Upper and Lower Egypt were unified and lasted over 3,000 years. This is longer than any civilization existing today. Egyptians achieved remarkable accomplishments in all fields: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, chemistry. The geometric knowledge used in pyramid construction, mummification techniques, the solar calendar system, and the decimal system all originated in Egypt. Particularly noteworthy is Egypt's temple school system. Egyptian temples were not merely religious facilities, but comprehensive educational institutions. They taught mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and this knowledge was systematically preserved and transmitted by priests. Greek philosophers learned in Egypt. Pythagoras studied mathematics and philosophy in Egypt for 22 years. Plato also visited Egypt and received teachings from priests. Archimedes researched mathematics in Alexandria. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, a considerable part of what is now called Greek philosophy was actually Greek translations of Egyptian wisdom. It's like a modern researcher translating foreign papers and publishing them under their own name. This could have happened in ancient times too. The Library of Alexandria was the knowledge center of the ancient world. It housed 700,000 books and papyri collected from around the world. Great scholars like Euclid, Eratosthenes, and Apollonius conducted research there, but this knowledge disappeared from Europe with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. After the 7th century Islamic conquest, much of Egypt's ancient knowledge was translated into Arabic and preserved. Baghdad's House of Wisdom became the new center of knowledge. During the Crusades, Europeans re-encountered this knowledge in the Middle East. Knowledge of geometry, algebra, astronomy, and alchemy was translated into Latin and transmitted to Europe. Mason guilds played an important role at this time. Building great cathedrals in medieval Europe required advanced geometric knowledge. This knowledge was secretly transmitted, and masons preserved techniques through strict apprenticeship systems. The geometric principles used by masons were based on ancient Egyptian and Greek knowledge. The golden ratio, sacred geometry, and proportional systems were all principles used in ancient Egyptian temple architecture. From the 18th century, these mason guilds began to change. Philosophical and educational purposes were strengthened rather than actual construction work. This is the beginning of modern Freemasonry. Early Freemasons showed deep interest in Egyptian civilization. They believed Egyptian temples were the true source of wisdom. Masonic lodge symbols, pyramids, the all-seeing eye, square and compass, all originated from Egypt. After Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, 1798 to 1801, Egyptology developed greatly in Europe. With the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the deciphering of hieroglyphs, ancient Egyptian knowledge began to receive attention again. But from the late 19th century, this trend changed. As European imperialism and racism strengthened, Egyptian civilization's achievements were gradually minimized or distorted. Attempts appeared to separate Black Africa from Egypt. Even today, Egyptian civilization's influence is found throughout Western civilization. The urban planning of Washington, D.C., the Louvre Pyramid in Paris, Cleopatra's Needle in London, all express reverence for Egyptian civilization. But in this borrowing process, the original context disappeared, leaving only Western interpretations. This is a classic case of cultural appropriation. Chapter 6. The Renaissance and the beginning of historical revision. Now we enter the era when the current Western civilization narrative began to be constructed in earnest. The Renaissance was not simply a rebirth of classical civilization, but the beginning of historical revision for a new European identity. The Renaissance, spanning from the 14th to 16th centuries, ostensibly advocated the revival of ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. but it was actually an ideological movement for Europeans centered in Italy to assert their cultural superiority. The key change of this period was the emergence of the concept of the Middle Ages equals Dark Ages. Renaissance humanists contrasted their era as light with the previous era as darkness. This was a rhetorical strategy rather than historical fact. The term Dark Ages, first used by Petrarch, actually reflects a very biased perspective. While medieval Europe was relatively stagnant, brilliant civilizations flourished in the Islamic world, Byzantine Empire, China, and India, during the same period. Renaissance artists and scholars idealized ancient Greece and Rome, but the antiquity they recreated was not actual history, but fantasy projected with their imagination and desires. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, the Renaissance was like modern retro culture. They long for the past, but actually reinterpret it according to current standards. The Greek gods painted by Renaissance artists look like 16th century Italians. Michelangelo's David clearly shows this. This sculpture follows ancient Greek sculptural style, but the actual model was a 16th century Italian youth. This was contemporary recreation rather than rebirth of ancient culture. The humanist movement can be understood in a similar context. Humanists studied ancient Greek and Roman texts, but their interpretations were greatly influenced by Christian worldview and political needs of the time. Particularly important was the emergence of the concept of original text. Renaissance scholars preferred pure Greek and Latin originals over texts that came through Arabic translations. But this was an expression of cultural superiority rather than knowledge purity. Greek philosophy and science, preserved and developed in the Arab world, were considered impure. The contributions of great Islamic philosophers like Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, were gradually ignored. With the development of printing, this biased historical view spread widely to the public. Gutenberg's printing press was invented around 1450 and spread throughout Europe over the next 100 years. Through this, Renaissance humanists' works were mass-produced and distributed. Changes in educational systems were also important. While medieval education was theology-centered, Renaissance education emphasized classical education. Latin and Greek, rhetoric and history became core subjects. But the history taught then was very selective. Greek and Roman glory was emphasized, but other ancient civilizations like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia were relatively ignored. The contributions of medieval Islamic civilization were similarly minimized. With the age of exploration, Europeans' confidence grew even more. The discovery of the American continent and the opening of trade routes with Africa and Asia strengthened the belief that Europe was the center of the world. In this process, the dichotomy between civilization and barbarism became more solid. The perception formed that Europe was the inheritor of civilization, and other regions were subjects to be civilized. The Protestant Reformation also strengthened this tendency. Protestants saw Roman Catholicism as corrupted Christianity and regarded themselves as restorers of pure Christianity. This further strengthened the dichotomy between purity and corruption. Chapter 7. The Dark Side of the Enlightenment and Scientific Revolution. The 18th century Enlightenment is regarded as the era of reason and science that current Western civilization takes pride in. But this period was when European centrism and racial hierarchy theories were systematized under scientific guise. Enlightenment philosophers presented reason as the key tool for understanding humans and society. Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, Kant all emphasized the importance of rational thinking. But their reason was never neutral. Voltaire praised British political institutions and religious tolerance in his letters on England. But he simultaneously revealed blatant prejudices against Jews and blacks. For him, reason was the exclusive domain of white European men. Immanuel Kant opened new horizons in Western philosophy with his critique of pure reason. But in anthropology, from a pragmatic point of view, he hierarchically classified races. He defined whites as the most superior race and other races as inferior beings. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, the universal reason of Enlightenment philosophers was actually the universalization of a very specific group's prejudices. It's like current Silicon Valley tech bros packaging their worldview as innovation. The scientific revolution had similar problems. The achievements of Galileo, Newton, Descartes certainly contributed to human intellectual history. But as their accomplishments were packaged as evidence of Europe's original genius, other civilizations' contributions were systematically ignored. For example, Galileo's telescopic observations were built upon Chinese and Islamic astronomical observation traditions. Newton's calculus owed much to Indian mathematicians' infinite series theories, but these facts were deliberately minimized. Carl von Linné's biological taxonomy claimed scientific objectivity, but actually contained deep prejudices. He classified humans into 4 subspecies, characterizing Europeans as creative and gentle, and Africans as lazy and careless. Georges Buffon argued in his Natural History that American continent life forms were degenerated compared to Europe. He even described Native Americans as smaller in stature and lower in intelligence than Europeans. This scientific racism was used to justify the slave trade. David Hume argued in A Treatise of Human Nature that blacks are intellectually inferior to whites. This was rationalization for economic profit, not philosophical reasoning. Even Adam Smith, while pointing out slavery's inefficiency in The Wealth of Nations, revealed prejudices about black intellectual ability. The economics of the invisible hand also presupposed certain racial superiority. The first edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica, 1768 to 1771, clearly reveals contemporary prejudices. The Negro entry described blacks as beings with low intelligence and laziness, presented as scientific fact. European centrism also appeared in botany and zoology. All newly discovered animals and plants received Latin scientific names, while names used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years were ignored. This was a declaration that Europe monopolized knowledge ownership. The same applied to medicine. European doctors dismissed traditional medicine from Africa, Asia, and America as superstition. But they secretly appropriated their herbal knowledge and treatments. Geography and cartography also reflected European centrism. The Mercator projection made Europe appear larger than actual size and Africa smaller. This was not merely a technical issue, but a conscious choice. In history, the concept of progress became central. Human history was explained as evolution from barbarism to civilization, with Europe considered at its peak. Other civilizations were all evaluated as stuck at some point in developmental stages. Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is considered a classic historical work, but it revealed religious and racial prejudices by identifying Christianity and barbarians as causes of Rome's fall. Chapter 8: Colonialism and the Institutionalization of White Supremacy. The 19th century was when European colonialism spread worldwide. During this period, white superiority became an institutionalized ideology beyond mere prejudice. White centrism was systematically constructed in all areas: science, religion, law, education. The 1884 Berlin Conference is a symbolic event of African partition. European powers gathered to divide the African continent like cutting cake. African opinions were not considered at all. This shows Europeans regarded themselves as Earth's masters. The core ideology of this period was the civilizing mission. Kipling's poem The White Man's Burden symbolically expressed this. That whites should civilize uncivilized peoples was presented as imperialism's moral justification, but the actual purpose was economic exploitation. King Leopold II of Belgium's rubber extraction business in Congo Free State drove millions of Congolese to death. Britain's salt monopoly policy in India drove tens of millions to starvation. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, the civilizing mission is essentially the same as current multinational corporations talking about sustainable development while plundering resources in developing countries. Only the packaging has changed. Scientific racism reached its peak during this period. Craniometry claimed to measure intelligence through skull size and shape. Samuel Morton collected hundreds of skulls and announced that whites have the largest brain capacity. But when Stephen Jay Gould re-examined Morton's research in the late 20th century, serious bias and manipulation were discovered. Morton deliberately created differences by packing white skulls tightly with sand, while loosely packing black skulls. Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, was the founder of eugenics. He argued that human intelligence and morality are inherited and advocated encouraging reproduction of superior races while suppressing reproduction of inferior races. Eugenics was considered progressive science until the early 20th century. In the United States, Canada, Australia, forced sterilization of indigenous peoples and people of color was legally permitted. This was a precursor to the Holocaust. Missionary activities were also tools of cultural imperialism. Christian missionaries destroyed indigenous traditional religions and cultures under the pretext of spreading the gospel. Throughout Africa, Asia, and America, indigenous religious sites were destroyed and replaced with Christian churches. Educational systems were key means of cultural assimilation. In colonies, local languages were banned, and only European languages were taught. In India, Thomas Macaulay declared that a single shelf of European books is worth more than all Indian and Arab literature. Museums and art galleries were also tools of imperialism. The British Museum, Louvre Museum, displayed cultural artifacts looted from colonies. This had the effect of showing off European civilization superiority while fossilizing other civilizations. Racial discrimination was also institutionalized in legal systems. America's one-drop rule was a law classifying anyone with even one drop of black blood as black. South Africa's apartheid legally enforced racial separation. Racism was packaged as science in medicine and biology. Drapetomania was a disease name that defined slaves' desire to escape as mental illness. The desire of blacks for freedom was seen as pathological symptoms. Anthropology and ethnology also served imperialism. Evolutionary anthropology divided humanity into stages of savagery, barbarism, civilization, claiming only Europeans reached the civilization stage. Other peoples were all treated as living fossils. European centrism also appeared in economics. Adam Smith's free trade theory actually presupposed European industrial advantage. Colonies were fixed in raw material supplier roles, and manufacturing development was deliberately suppressed. Chapter 9. Modern Society's Civilization Monopoly Phenomenon. Entering the 20th and 21st centuries, overt racism seems to have disappeared on the surface. But monopolistic narratives about civilization continue in more subtle and sophisticated forms. Now we examine the mechanisms of cultural hegemony occurring in modern society. The Hollywood film industry is a key tool for modern myth creation. In movies about ancient Egypt, pharaohs and nobles are played by white actors, while only slaves and lower classes are portrayed by people of color. Films like Exodus, Gods and Kings, and Gods of Egypt are representative examples. Movies about Greek mythology are the same. In Troy, 300 Percy Jackson series, Greeks all look like Northern European whites. The actual Mediterranean appearance of ancient Greeks is completely ignored. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, modern blockbuster movies are like Photoshop for history. They erase all uncomfortable truths and leave only what they want to see. Problems continue in curricula. In most Western educational curricula, world history is still constructed centered on European history. In ancient civilization units, Egypt and Mesopotamia are briefly mentioned before immediately moving to Greece and Rome. Contributions of Chinese, Indian, and Islamic civilizations are relatively minimized. Art history education is the same. Western art history is treated as if it were world art history. African, Asian, and Native American art is classified as primitive art or folk art and treated separately. Western centrism continues in academic publishing. Major academic journals are mostly based in the West, and research not published in English is difficult to cite. This reproduces inequality in knowledge production. Exhibition methods in museums and art galleries are also problematic. By displaying separately as Egyptian Hall, Asian Hall, African Hall, they make these civilizations appear as if they developed in isolation. Exchanges and mutual influences between civilizations are not well revealed. Archaeology and cultural property return issues remain unresolved. The British Museum's Elgin marbles, Berlin Museum's Pergamon altar, France's Rosetta Stone still haven't returned to their original places. Language hegemony is also an important issue. As English became the international lingua franca, English-speaking culture's influence spread worldwide. Knowledge and culture in other languages are difficult to become internationally known unless translated. Internet and social media platforms are also Western-centric. Algorithms and search results of major platforms like Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube prioritize English content and Western perspectives. Western centrism appears in science and technology fields too. The overwhelming majority of Nobel Prize winners in science are from the West, but this reflects inequality in research environments and opportunities rather than simple ability differences. There's also bias in medical research. Most clinical trials are conducted on white subjects, and effects on other races are not sufficiently verified. International law and human rights systems also present Western values as universal. Western human rights concepts emphasizing individual rights are prioritized over other cultural values emphasizing community harmony. Western models are regarded as standard in economic systems. Free market economy is presented as the only economic development model, and other economic systems are evaluated as inefficient or backward. In architecture and urban planning, Western styles are considered modern and advanced. Traditional architectural styles are preserved only as tourist products, while Western-style buildings are preferred in actual living spaces. Fashion and beauty standards are also Western-centric. Global fashion brands are mostly based in the West, and beauty standards also present Western appearances as ideals. The popularity of skin-whitening products shows this bias. Chapter 10. Toward Truthful Historical Recognition. Seeking New Paradigms. Now we've reached the final point of this long journey. What we've examined so far was the history of a massive illusion constructed over thousands of years. Now it's time to remove this illusion and move toward truthful historical recognition. First, we must realize that civilization is not the monopoly of one race or region. All of humanity's great achievements came through interactions between diverse cultures and peoples. The mathematical concept of zero began in India, paper and gunpowder in China, algebra in the Islamic world. What we now call Western science is actually a collaboration of worldwide knowledge. Galileo's telescope would have been impossible without Chinese lens technology and Islamic optical theory. Newton's mathematics was also built upon mathematical achievements from India and the Arab world. The same applies to medicine. Current Western medicine was influenced by various medical traditions. Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, Islamic medicine, African traditional medicine. Many substances used as anesthetics came from indigenous traditional knowledge. To add a slightly cynical perspective here, the current intellectual property system is like patenting food recipes. It's an attempt by specific groups to monopolize knowledge developed jointly by humanity over thousands of years. For true historical recognition, we must first abandon the concept of civilization hierarchy. The linear development model of Stone Age to Bronze Age, agricultural society to industrial society, is a very Europe-centric perspective. Actually, each civilization walked unique development paths suited to their environment and needs. That Amazon indigenous peoples accurately know the pharmacological effects of thousands of plant species is their own advanced science. Indonesia's traditional shipbuilding techniques already embodied principles of modern naval architecture. Africa's iron-making technology was hundreds of years ahead of Europe. Language diversity must also be recognized. Currently, there are about 7,000 languages in the world, but dozens disappear annually. Each language contains unique worldviews and knowledge systems. Language extinction is not simply loss of communication tools, but loss of human knowledge. Pluralistic approaches are needed in religion and philosophy too. Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, as well as numerous indigenous religions, each provide deep insights into the human condition. No religion or philosophy can monopolize truth. Educational system reform is urgent. In world history education, all continents and civilizations should be covered in balance. Africa's Mali Empire, America's Inca civilization, Asia's Angkor Empire should be taught as importantly as Greece and Rome. Science education should also introduce various knowledge traditions. It should be taught that Western science is not the only knowledge system, but that various cultures have different ways of understanding nature. Media and entertainment industry responsibility is great. Movies and dramas dealing with history should be faithful to historical evidence. Portraying ancient Egyptians as white or always depicting Africa as primitive must stop. Museums and art galleries must also change exhibition methods. Instead of displaying each civilization as isolated, they should show exchanges and mutual influences between civilizations. And looted cultural artifacts should be returned to their original places. Changes are needed in academic research too. Instead of taking only Western-centric research methodologies and theories as the sole standard, knowledge systems and research methods from various cultures should be recognized. Diversity should be recognized in economic development models too. Western-style capitalism is not the only development model. Each society should be able to choose development paths suited to their culture and environment. In technological development, combinations of traditional knowledge and modern science should be sought. Traditional agricultural techniques, architectural techniques, medical knowledge can provide important clues for solving modern problems. Most importantly, humility is needed. No civilization or culture can claim superiority over all others. We are all one human species, having found different answers in different environments. True globalization is not one culture dominating all others, but all cultures communicating and exchanging equally. This is not merely an ideal, but an essential condition for humanity's survival. Current problems facing humanity, climate change, pandemics, resource depletion, cannot be solved with any single culture's wisdom alone. Only by gathering wisdom from all cultures worldwide can we find answers. Conclusion. Reassembling the broken mirror. Dear listeners, we have taken a long journey together today. Starting from the Caucasus Mountains, we examined the reality of ancient Greece and Rome and explored the brilliant civilization of the Moorish Empire. We looked at the Germanic migration south and the transmission of Egyptian wisdom and uncovered mechanisms of historical distortion from the Renaissance to the present. What did we discover through this journey? The fact that the Western civilization narrative we currently take for granted is actually a very artificial and selective construct. True history is not the monopoly of one race or region, but the joint work of all humanity. Do you remember the broken mirror we mentioned in the introduction? Now we know how and why those cracks formed. Now it's time to reassemble that mirror. But we're not trying to restore it to its original state. Rather, we must create a bigger mirror, one with broader vision, a mirror that reflects the contributions of all civilizations and all peoples. This is not about glorifying the past or denying the present. It's about facing the truth and building a better future on that truth. Civilization built on false superiority will eventually collapse. We must start with what each of us can do. Change begins with the books we read, the movies we watch, the content we teach, the conversations we share. When teaching history to children, tell them not only about Greece and Rome, but also about Egypt and Mesopotamia, China and India, and the civilizations of Africa and America. Let them know that great inventions and discoveries came from all over the world. When consuming media, think critically. Consider whether depictions in historical dramas or movies are based on historical facts or reflect specific prejudices. When meeting other cultures, have an open mind. Look for what you can learn from their knowledge and wisdom. See cultural diversity as an opportunity, not a threat. Most important is humility. We are all just fragments of vast human history. No individual, no people, no civilization has accomplished everything. We all stand on each other's shoulders. The Bible says, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." Proverbs 16:18. This truth applies not only to individuals, but to peoples and civilizations. It also says, "From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth." Acts 17:26. We are all one human family. Superiority is not determined by different skin colors or origins. It says that God's people come from every tribe and language and people and nation. Revelation 5:9. In God's plan, every people has unique value and role. Dear listeners, thank you sincerely for taking this long journey with me today. Seeking truth can sometimes be uncomfortable and difficult, but that is precisely the path to becoming better humans and creating a better world. I hope this audiobook brings even small changes to your lives. And I hope you share this story with others so that seeds of truth spread more widely. I will continue to meet you with content that explores more truth and shares deeper wisdom. Your YouTube subscriptions, likes, and comments sharing your thoughts will be a great encouragement. Thank you once again, and I pray that wisdom and peace accompany all your lives.